I'm extremely sorry because I'm doing this for the first time in both uh, over the Facebook as well as YouTube, and I'm all alone. I'm trying to configure both presentation as well as the method to yeah, yeah, great. So let's start with the presentation. Okay, so let me start right from the beginning. Uh, Today I'm going to talk about camera modes. The camera modes are basically the dial on top of your camera, which is basically the ones which you keep on changing to different settings. And here is what we finally use at the end of determining what exposure we are going to keep. See, the pictures what you're going to take have three components as far as the camera is concerned. One is the aperture, the other one is the shutter speed, and third one is the ISO. These three together will determine the exposure of the picture. When I say exposure, it's basically whether it's brighter or darker. Whether I'm taking a good exposure, which most of the time when we say good exposure, it's usually the ones where the brightness is adequate, not too much, the features are not blown out, and if it is a frozen picture in fast shutter speed, it will be frozen, or if it is a slow shutter speed, that is where you're going to get blurry picture. Sometimes this blur is useful. For example, when you're taking a waterfall or something like that, see, I'll explain about the different modes, but I'm not going to go deep into exposure on aperture, shutter speed, ISO. These are topics on their own, and it's not worth dwelling today on that particular topic. So when we talk about this exposure, we depend on our camera's meter. This is the light meter, what you see when you look through the viewfinder. The light meter at the bottom, what you see is the one which really shows whether it's underexposed or whether it's overexposed. So this one in the blue is the light meter, and within that there is an exposure indicator. This indicator, as you change your shutter speed, which is in this case is 500, or the aperture, which is in this case f4.0, or the ISO, which is 400. So when you change any one of these parameters, the meter moves either to the left, showing that it is underexposed, or to the right, showing that it is overexposed. So by putting the meter right at the center, you're going to believe that camera has really taken a good exposure and going to show you. So where are these three components? The components what we talk about, the exposure are basically the aperture, which is inside the lens. Then you have the shutter speed, which is basically the shutter moves up and down, and the time between that. And lastly, the ISO. So all these three together will make aperture, shutter speed, ISO. So that's the one, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Those three, the ISO is in the sensor. So those three really make what's called the exposure triangle. Initially, when I talked about exposure triangle, this is the three parts. Now, what happens when the exposure is exact? For example, here there is a gray box, and your camera tries to photograph it, and it shows in the center. When you click it, it's even exposure which will be there, and that even exposure will give you a gray box. If you underexpose that particular picture, the gray box will be shot as a dark box. Whereas when you overexpose it, it will be shot as a white box. So the same color, gray, can be underexposed to make it black or overexposed to make it white. So what's good? That depends on the photographer, not on the camera, but on the photographer. Suppose you want to have a gray screen, which we want to make it white, you can go for overexposure, or the other way around. Like if you want to make something black, you can go for underexposure. So basically, you are manipulating three components. The three components are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's take aperture for example. Aperture, I don't want to go into details, but aperture can be a large aperture like 1.4, f1.4, or a very small aperture like f22, or somewhere in between f5.6. Coming to shutter speed, the fast shutter speed is 8,000. 8,000, when the camera says 8,000, it's really 1 by 8,000th of a second. When it says 125, it's 1 by 125th of a second. If you go down, somewhere here is a 1 second. 1 second mark is with the two quotes on the top, and it goes all the way down to 30 seconds. So it's from 8,000th of a second to 30 seconds is what the shutter speed in most of the cameras. These are not brand specific. I'm just giving you an outline of how each one of the company's cameras show. Some of your camera may show it differently, may have a different color, but overall, most of the cameras will have this. Lower end cameras may not have 1 by 8,000th of a second, but 1 by 4,000th of a second will be there. Lastly, coming to ISO. ISO is from 100, and sometimes it goes up to now the newer cameras, it goes all the way up to nearly 4 lakh something ISO. So there can be so much of difference between camera to camera, but ISO generally starts from 100. In some cameras it starts from 200, which is the base ISO, but most of the time it's 100. Now, in this picture, I have not given one-third stops. In your ISO, there will be ISO 60, ISO 100, ISO 120, ISO 180, 200, 250, and so on. I gave the round figure version. This is 100, 200, 400. So similarly, like this. Here also, there can be a in-between settings, which are for fine-tuning, like one-third stops are there, which are basically for fine-tuning the uh, so now coming to the next part, that is what each one of these settings do. Now in your camera, today's topic is exposure modes. So this is the dial which is there. It may be slightly different in Canon and Nikon, but overall the dials are still there. So there are two different type of dials. There is a set of green dials all around, which are basically meant for auto modes. Now, these auto modes don't allow you much of a leeway as far as controlling is concerned. So it's better stick with just uh, the four manual modes, the P, S, A, and M. I'll explain about that because auto modes don't give you any chance of trying to manipulate your picture the way you want it. So let's go briefly about these auto modes. What do? They calculate exposure for you. They calculate the shutter speed for you. They calculate the aperture for you. They calculate the ISO. They calculate the focus, whether the flash should be on or off. All these are calculated. So manual overriding in most of these modes, in most of the cameras, are prohibited. In some high-end cameras, may allow you to do it. I generally don't use this particular mode. And in case you want to use it, there is only one choice uh, when you use this particular mode. See, most of the time when we take a photograph, we also want to take a selfie, either ourselves or with our group. So we give a camera to somebody else to take a photograph. Now, if you had manipulated different settings, sorry, whether it's P mode, S mode, A mode, or M mode, and then you give the camera to a stranger who doesn't know anything about clicking, he might mess it up. So ideally, when you give this camera to somebody else to take photograph, what you do is you give it putting in the auto mode. So chances are that he won't be able to mess it up because camera does most of the setting. So ideally, only that is the only point when you use these auto modes. For everything else, you use other modes. Now coming to the next mode, this is the program mode. Program mode is a slight upgrade from auto mode. What it does is it calculates your aperture, it calculates your shutter speed. Now, you may say that's fantastic because camera does everything. What what is the problem of using this particular mode? Why should I not use this? I'll tell you when you are creative with your photograph, when you want something you imagine or you want it to be in the photograph, but your camera does totally different. Now, this is what most of the mobile phones do, because most of the settings in them, unless you go for the pro settings, is the program mode. All you can do is you can adjust the aperture or shutter speed. They all go in pairs. So when you change aperture, the shutter speed changes and ISO changes. So somewhere you can find a sweet spot of what you want and you will get a good results. And most of the time, you will be only able to adjust your aperture and shutter speed in auto mode. The ISO is calculated automatically in most of the this program mode. Even though it's called a program mode, it's not really a program mode. It is a sort of a sophisticated auto mode. So don't believe that the program mode is a very sophisticated mode. And unfortunately, there is one more drawback of this particular program mode. You have set, let's say that I want to shoot in 5.6 and 60. If there is a timeout, what happens is that the camera resets. So again, you'll come back to 22 and 1000, which you don't want. So how do you change these settings? See, in your camera, there will be a dial, either in the front dial or the back dial or dial somewhere. So that allows you to shift the programs, but all of them shift in a pair. So when you change the aperture, the shutter speed also changes. So all these are auto modes. And again, this is not a good point to start. So I don't advise you either stick with auto mode or the program. So then we are left with only three modes. Let's go to one of those modes. Canon calls it TV mode. It means time value. It's not that you will be able to watch TV in your camera, but it's called a TV mode. And Nikon and most of the other companies call it as a yes, shutter speed. So it's a shutter priority mode. That means you set the shutter. Why do you want to set the shutter? I'll explain that in the next picture. So when you want to set a shutter speed of a particular value, you are telling camera that I want to shoot in only this shutter speed and nothing else. So the shutter speed is fixed by you. What camera does is it adjusts the aperture depending on the light. Now, let's talk about two shots. These both are waterfalls. So if you want a faster shutter speed waterfall, this is how that waterfall looks. And if you want the same waterfall look in a slower shutter speed, this is how it looks. So for this, I have used 1 second shutter speed. For this, I have used 1 by 250th of a second. So here, water droplets, if you see, are sort of frozen. They are frozen in them. So it doesn't look like a flow, whereas in a slower shutter speed, it looks like a flow. So you get a classic um, waterfall look. So this is how you shoot depending on your need, not what camera does. So if you had used either a program mode or auto mode, the camera would have gone for this particular mode because the water is moving and you are hand holding the camera. Then it decides, okay, this is a fast shutter speed, so I'll click. So you will never get this sort of smooth flowing water. Now there is drawback of this slow shutter speed. You can't handhold this camera at this uh, particular slower shutter speed. You need a tripod or any other support, but you can give your own shutter speed for this particular shot. Now here is a shot of a pigeon flying. Now these are not 11 pigeons. This is the same pigeon flying. I've taken sequence of 11 shots, one after the other in the burst mode, and I compiled all of them on a single frame using Photoshop. So this is just wanted to show the wing flap of a pigeon. But capture this pigeon in that particular sharpness, you need 1 by 2000th of a second. Or if you go to a sports, for example, we have a folk sports in our place. This is called Kambla, where the two buffaloes are being raced on a slushy, muddy track. And what you're seeing is a frozen moment where the buffaloes are on air and the person behind it is running behind it and the splash of water. It's a muddy water, so that's why you get that bright splash. As well as here, this area, there is a reflection. So to freeze all of this, you need 1 by 4000 of a second. Now, if you go to a beach, you won't see this particular type of image. That's because the waves are there. But if you go for what's called a slow shutter speed photography, something like 10 seconds exposure, the waves totally disappear because all that is moving fast will totally disappear. And what you see is a calm sea. So if you want that sort of photograph, you need to go for a slow shutter speed. And that's where all the shutter priority comes in. It allows you to adjust your shutter speed to what you want, and aperture will get adjusted on its own. Now coming to another mode, which is aperture priority. Here you decide the aperture. And the aperture, why you want to decide? Okay, I'll explain it in the next slide. Because once you fix the aperture, the shutter speed gets adjusted on its own in a nice way so that you'll be able to get the depth what you want without getting uh, the aperture either shallow or deep. So aperture is fixed in aperture priority. That's what aperture priority mode is. AV is what Canon puts it, aperture value, and A what Nikon and Sony and other cameras put. So, um, what's the use of aperture? So let's see here. These are two shots of a same butterfly. So when I shot this, the bud behind it is out of focus. That's because of a shallow depth of field created by aperture f4. Whereas if I wanted both of them in focus, I can use f11 and take both of them in focus. They both will be in sharp focus. Remember, out of focus is a characteristic of a camera. Human eye cannot see this. Or in the field, you'll be able to see both the butterfly as well as the background in sharp focus. Even small cameras like the mobile cameras, you won't be able to see this shallow depth of field. That's why the modern cameras, what they do is they electronically create a depth of field by blurring out the background. But that's not as good as what you can really capture with the camera. So if you want both the foreground as well as the background in focus, you'll be doing it using aperture priority and keeping a aperture which is small. Small in the sense f11 is a small aperture, f4 is a large aperture. So this is a large aperture which gives you a shallow depth of field, and a small aperture will give you a deep depth of field. Here is another example. Landscape photographies, we usually use the foreground to background, everything in focus. This needed something like f16 aperture to get this particular thing. Both to the temple, everything is in focus. Sometimes you are forced to get that particular thing. I'm a macro photographer, so this mosquito, I wanted it to be sharp from the hind leg right up to the proboscis. So if everything needs to be sharp, when you go extremely close using a macro lens, you also need to use like f14 or f16 aperture. So that's why aperture priority really comes, and the shutter speed is already calculated with that. But what's the drawback? Why not we use aperture priority for most of the purposes? See, what happens is when you are in f8 and f5.6, f4, shutter speed is fine because there is enough light. But when you go for a very small aperture, you need to have a slower shutter speed. And if you're hand holding it, you will end up in a blurred motion. Or if you're going for very shallow depth of field, then you will be able to fix it. So, but previous two pictures, for example, the F-16 of the boat, I had to use a tripod because the light was so low and it needed like half a second exposure. Hand holding that camera at half a second exposure is not possible. So there is a give and take with both when you're going for aperture priority as well as the shutter speed. So you look at the shutter speed. If shutter speed is below a certain point, the certain point is something easy to calculate. Think of your focal length of the lens. So if you are using a 50 lens, that is 1 by 50 is your slowest shutter speed. So if you are using a 100 lens, 1 by 100 is your slowest shutter speed, hand holding. Anything slower than that, your picture will become blurry. So ideally, what you have to do is you have to put it on a tripod and then start using it. Now, we talked about all these three uh, modes, which are the most useful modes. That is the leaving out the program mode, you have the shutter priority mode and aperture priority. Now, the last one is the manual mode, which I'll talk about uh, later. But before that, see what happens is the camera decides where the meter has to be. So if it is a gray box or a good picture or a landscape, whatever you are shooting, when you are shooting, you will be looking at this particular meter. And meter is not always right. So sometime meter may go wrong. And when it goes wrong, you should be able to overcome that particular meter's mistake. So that's where for both these modes, that is program mode, sorry, all three modes, program mode, aperture priority mode, as well as shutter priority mode, you should be able to change the values. So all the time when the meter is straight, it's fine. But what if the meter gives you a wrong reading? For example, this is a picture of an elephant's eye. You see, in this, the elephant's eye looks fine. That's because the meter is in the center. Sometimes it gives you a minus value, so this is underexposed, or a plus value, which is overexposed. So you have to decide which value is good for you, your picture. In fact, this particular elephant, this is a captive elephant. It was not having this black skin, so it was brighter skin. So I preferred this particular look than these two looks. So I wanted this look, but unfortunately, the camera gave this particular thing. Or the camera has inherent problem in the metering. If the object is too bright or too dark, it will give you a wrong reading. So meter is not always right. For example, if you go to a snowy place, your camera will show you something as it is in the left, whereas your eyes will be seeing the snow, which is as in the right. So if you take a picture believing the camera's metering, you will get a picture which is something similar as in the left. So what you have to do is you have to push the meter so that it overexposes slightly. If you are a fan of a crow and want to take a close-up of a crow, again the same thing happens. The crow gets overexposed, whereas this is how the crow was looking at in the field. So you have to underexpose a darker subject. So this is where the dials which you see next to the change of aperture shutter speed dial, these are called exposure compensation dials. They are different. This is how it looks in Canon, and this is how it looks in Nikon. These are how it looks in Sony and other cameras. So, but these are the dials which allow you to either make the meter move minus or plus. So in any one of these aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, or a program mode, if you want to change the exposure, you use uh, those dials, the plus CV or minus CV. When you do plus CV, for example, if you are in the snow area, white area, you have to go for the plus. For that crow, I had to do it minus. So that's how the aperture and shutter and program mode really works. Now, which one to choose in this? Remember, if you count the total number of apertures, there are only 8 apertures. Whereas if you count the number of shutter speed modes, there are nearly 18 shutter speed modes. That means if you take shutter priority mode as your main mode, problem what happens is if you go either too much higher or too much lower, depends on the light, then you're running out of the aperture to compensate that. So ideally, if you want to choose between these three modes, one mode, I would choose aperture priority because there is no chance of running out because you can choose whatever aperture you feel like. And this is why most of the people who are going, let's say the wildlife photographers, landscape photographers, all of them use aperture priority. The only people who use shutter priority mode are those again in the landscape mode where you want a slower shutter speed, or those in the sports photography field who want a faster shutter speed, or somebody who is shooting bird in flight, those faster shutter speed. So they are the only ones who use shutter priority, but most of them um, commonly use aperture priority. Now, the last mode, which is the most useful mode, is the manual mode. What manual mode allows you to do is not bother about that exposure compensation and allows you to manually adjust your aperture, shutter speed, ISO as you want so that the meter is in the center if you are shooting an average picture, or if you are shooting a bright picture, something like that snow I mentioned, it can be +1, or if you are shooting a crow close up or a blackboard close up, you can keep it at a -1 or -2, depending on the darkness what the camera captures and gives you. So this is the most versatile mode if you have a free time to adjust your settings. For those who are in a hurry, it's better to keep it in aperture priority, which is the most safe mode other than the manual mode. So among all these modes, don't keep it in program mode, don't keep it in shutter priority mode. Choose either a manual mode, or if you are in a hurry, go for aperture priority mode. Decide the depth of field you are going to take. Either you want a shallow depth of field or deep depth of field. So I have created a sort of a algorithm where you can decide how you're going to choose this particular mode. So this is how it is. Now, whether your subject is moving or not moving. If it is not moving, then you have two options. Do you want to freeze the motion? Sorry, if it is moving, I'm sorry. If your subject is moving, then you have two options. You are going to either freeze the motion or you're going to blur the motion. So for freezing the motion, you need to have faster shutter speed. For blurring the motion, you need to have slower shutter speed. This is where you decide the shutter speed. Now the next option, what happens is, if your subject is not moving, then you have three options. Do you want a maximum depth of field? Do you want to have a maximum sharpness? Or do you want to have a shallow depth of field? So depending on this algorithm, you can decide what you want. So the algorithm is very simple. So if you want a freeze motion, you'll be going somewhere between 250th of a shutter speed to 8000th of a shutter speed. If you want to blur a motion, you go between 1/30th of a shutter speed to 30-second shutter speed. So if a subject is moving, you are deciding whether you are going to go this set of images or this set of images. Any one of them is fine, because if you choose 1/30th of a second, what happens is your blur is very slight. Whereas if you take it at about 1 second, your blur of the subject is much more. And if you go to something like 15 seconds or 30 seconds, the blur is so much that it's very calm sort of blur, as I showed you in the earlier picture. Now, the second, your subject is stationary. Then do you want a maximum depth of field? Do you want a maximum sharpness? Do you want a shallow depth of field? So F11 to F22 will give you depth of field. F4 to F8 will give you a maximum sharpness, and F1.4 to F2.8 will give you a shallow depth. So you decide on these criteria and then you go for that particular thing. Now you might ask why I didn't talk about ISO. Now this is what you have to do with the ISO. All the time, keep the ISO at 100. That's the optimum quality of ISO. ISO has optimum quality at 100. For most cameras, it's ISO 100. There are very few cameras where ISO 200 is good. You can see that in your setting itself. So if your setting says the lowest setting without alteration in your camera is 200, then that's the optimum setting. But 99% of all the cameras, usually the 100 ISO 100 is the optimal quality. Then the next comes, stick with the high ISO 100. Now let me go to the previous slide. You have chosen one of these or one of these or one of these settings, and then unfortunately, when you want a maximum depth of field, let's say that you want to keep it at f11, plus you want a freeze motion, like 1 by 2000th of a second. So when you do both of them, the light is not enough. Your meter shows minus. So that is where you are going to adjust the ISO. So you raise the ISO only for that faster shutter speed, only for when you want it. Other than that, you always keep it at 100. So don't raise the ISO until you really need it. So this is basically today's presentation. I would like to have questions. I'll try to answer first the questions in the Zoom meeting. Then I'll try to answer all those live questions which are there in the Facebook as well as uh, YouTube. No, that's not related to this particular topic. I'll discuss with that sometime later. IS is basically image stabilization. ISO, okay, sorry. I heard it as IS. Okay. What is the use of a IS? So, okay, you need that particular ISO. That's basically the sensitivity. Because see, what happens is you have taken up some amount of light using your aperture, some amount of light using your shutter speed. I'll go to that particular slide. Let's say that you are using a high shutter speed and a small ISO. Then what happens is your light is not enough to read the sensor, because you have cut down the light as far as the aperture is concerned, cut down the time it takes to enter into the lens also you have taken it. So that's why the light is not enough. So your picture will be underexposed. Uh, Highly underexposed picture, if you try to take it into any of the editing softwares, for example, Photoshop or something like that, then you are going to get a lot of grains. So your camera, to a certain extent, can manage it using ISO. ISO is like most of our music volume settings. So when you put a volume, when you turn the volume knob, it's not that as though that guy is going to sing brighter. It's electronically getting boosted. The same thing happens in ISO. It is just boosting the particular uh, image which has come to the sensor and then trying to give you the image which is optimum in quality. Okay, is there any? I think there are questions in chat. I'll answer each one of them. Yeah, I think I answered about your ISO questions. Okay. Subhashis, thank you for your compliment that it's a nice presentation. If you have any other questions, please type it in the chat. Meanwhile, I'll try to go to YouTube channel. YouTube, any sorry, YouTube, any questions in there? Okay, on YouTube there are no questions. Uh, okay, I want to take up few of the questions which were asked earlier. Uh, Let me see if I can answer them. Veerapandian has asked, which is the best brand of camera mobile? Okay, iPhone and Google Pixels are the best as far as the cameras, as far as camera inside the mobile are concerned. Unfortunately, Pixel is not available in India, uh, so it's only the lower end of the Pixel. The Pixel 4 and Pixel 3, I think one of them are the better ones. Most of the Android phone cameras are okay. They are not very good. Uh, when you're buying a camera, as far as a mobile phone, look for that which has got a lower megapixel than a higher megapixel. All these companies recently are marketing those with the camera which is something like 48 megapixel, 60 megapixel. Those are the ones in a very small sensor will really produce a very blurry image. So it's just a marketing technique. 12 megapixel to 18 megapixel is more than enough, and in fact, they give you a better picture than a small sensor with higher megapixel. So just look for the brands which still give you a a better quality than better quantity. Kabir has asked a question. I'm using P900. I don't get sharp photos when zooming the lens. See, what happens is P900 has a same sensor as that of a mobile phone. Imagine doing the 2000 zoom. It is trying to do what is called a digital zoom. There is a physical zoom, and then after that, there is a digital zoom. Stick with only the physical zoom. Don't go for that digital zoom. And it also has a ISO which is quite bad in the lower ISO. Aperture, I think it starts somewhere at about 6, which again is bad for low light photography. It's good documenting camera than anything else. They marketed it well. That's why it's selling that much. Okay, then the next question is, uh, could you explain the settings for boat picture? Okay, that boat picture was f16 ISO 100 or 200. I'm not very sure. Uh, and half a second exposure. So I had gone there in the late evening to take this particular photograph. This is a place called Varanga, which is between Karkala and Agumbe. So between that, this particular Jain temple, which is situated inside the lake, there is a boat guy who takes this particular boat trip from the shores right up to the temple and brings it back. So this was late in the evening. Sun had already set. So I had a tripod. So I used slower shutter speed of half a second, but f16 to get the depth of field. So and it is a wide angle lens. I think it was a 16 lens at a 16 since the boat was very close, that boat looks like that. It looks distorted, but that's a setting I used. Okay, Tarun has asked, since you are more into macro, what equipment we need to do a macro photography? Okay, you need a macro lens. If you don't have a macro lens, there are other methods of getting a good macro even without macro lens. So one is you can reverse the lens, 50 lens which can be reversed together, or there are adapters which are available called Raynox 150 or 250 adapters, which can be fitted in front of any of your regular lenses, and then automatically that lens becomes a macro lens. The other thing is aperture. You need to go for something like f8 or f11 aperture when you are that close to get the depth of it. Otherwise, what happens is only part of the insect will be in focus and the rest of it will be uh, out of focus. Okay, Chetan has asked, today's class done so fast. I wanted more time for discussion than explaining too many things. Now, since it's there in Facebook as well as YouTube, you can always go back and listen to this again because recording will be there. Only thing is skip the first part where we were doing the testing and start off from point where we started the actual webinar. Okay, how to capture conjunction? Okay, conjunction is the one which is happening between Jupiter and Saturn. So both of them are coming together on 21st of this month, and they can be captured using a regular camera and regular lens. In fact, the conjecture is visible to your naked eye. You don't need this thing. If you have a binocular, you can watch it. If you have any tele lens, you can capture it using a tele lens. Uh, Only thing what you have to do is play around with the manual mode, because auto mode, what happens is it looks at the black sky in the night and then tries to boost up the aperture as well, sorry, boost up the shutter ISO as well as try to make your shutter speed go very slow. So ideally go for the widest aperture, ISO 1600, and a shutter speed of handholdable something like uh, 1 by 40, 1 by 50 if you are using a normal regular lens. So using that, you will be able to capture. And this can be captured even with the mobile. Those who are having a mobile, you can capture this conjuncture. Uh, this is happening once in 800 years. The last conjuncture happened around 784 years back. So we are lucky that we are in this point on December 21st. It's there in only December 21st. Now, tonight, if you go and see, Jupiter and Saturn are very, very close. But on the day of conjecture, they are extremely close as though they look like a dual planet. So if there are no questions, I think we can. Mustafa, shall we stop this thing? Or yeah, we answer the question. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. Just a note, uh, Paraniti competition is still on. So please go to www.paranitifoundation.com. Please participate in the webinar, in the competition. And this webinar is really sponsored by your competition. So if you don't participate, I'll be disappointed. Thank you. Link of what? Uh, um, you just search for date and time. Date and time. It's a website called Date and Time. For that conjecture, right? You're asking. That website is in the banner. See the link of this particular thing. The first screen you saw, which was showing the link. At the bottom of that, there is a website. There is a competition which is going on. It's a competition for a charity. So this competition, you all can participate. So parinatifoundation.com, www.parinati foundation, PARINATI foundation.com. Just go there. All the details are there in the page. And the last day is 31st of December. So hurry up. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. See you next time.